Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the first in a four-part series of leadership webinars offered by the Office of Alumni Engagement. This series wouldn't have been possible without our partnership with the Gardner Center and the fantastic support of the Conference and Event Services team at Memorial's Emera Innovation Exchange. Before we get things underway, I just wanted to take a brief moment to thank all of you for taking the time to connect with us online today. Life has certainly gotten a tad more challenging, and we're all affected differently. But here we are today, a family of alumni and friends sharing in the desire to connect, learn, and grow. So for all the ups and downs that we're all facing, I just want to say thank you for all your efforts to get through this one day at a time and for joining us today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Dianne Ford with us to discuss the risks of virtual harassment and cyberbullying. Dr. Ford is a professor at the Faculty of Business Administration with a bachelor's in psychology and a double major in management information systems and organizational behavior with her PhD. She conducts research on knowledge management, social media, and cyber deviance, in particular virtual harassment and cyber incivility. She teaches organizations on how to create respectful workplaces to prevent harassment and bullying through the Gardner Center, and has also provided consultation work on remote work and its implications for employees and organizations. We're testing out a new online platform here today, so everyone please be patient. If any glitches occur, we're in really good hands, but your patience is always appreciated. Dr. Ford will present for 20 minutes, give or take, followed by a Q&A period. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat at any time on your right-hand side of your screen, and I'll read those questions aloud to Dr. Ford after her presentation is over. Dr. Ford, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, and I thank you for this opportunity to present on this issue. So today we're going to talk about the risks of virtual harassment and cyberbullying. In particular, what we're going to look at is I'm going to give you some definitions, a little bit of background information about these behaviors and issues, but then get into what I'll have 6 recommendations. Some of these 6 recommendations seem a little bit weird and off the cuff, but they are research-based and get more towards the respectful workplace as opposed to trying to deal with after-the-fact incidents of harassment or bullying. So before we get into the recommendations, I would like to define what is for workplace mistreatment. So harassment is a legal term for behavior that is an improper conduct by an individual that is directed at and offensive to another individual in the workplace, including at any event or any location related to work, and that the individual knew or ought reasonably to have known would cause offense or harm. Now, I've highlighted in here that at any location related to work because with the COVID-19 pandemic and the immediate remote work scenario with non-essential services, we have moved our workplace into our homes. So even though the home is a private space, it is now still related to work. So when employees are doing their work in their home, just because they're outside that brick and mortar building, the organization is still responsible for protecting them from harassment in that space. Bullying is what I liken to a mean cousin of harassment. It's basically some of the same behaviors of harassment, but done with such a persistent pattern of mistreatment that it causes physical or emotional harm. So bullying and harassment, and even this behavior called incivility, often have the same behaviors, but they differ based on the frequency and perhaps the targetedness of it. So bullying is very targeted behavior towards an individual. Harassment, again, is about an individual. Incivility can be a bit more random, but still happen to an individual. Before we move on to the virtual harassment and cyberbullying, it's important to know that approximately 90% of targets of traditional forms of harassment and bullying also experience it through computer-mediated means. So computer-mediated means is everything from your computer, laptop, tablet, smartphone, those kinds of technologies, we call those information and communication technologies. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic, these were co-occurring. You could be harassed in the workplace, but then also get it through email, for example, in your home. Right? So research suggests that computer-mediated mistreatment has more profound effects on their targets than only face-to-face harassment or bullying. For example, there was one study that was a bunch of interviews by De Cruz and Nerona, and one of their participants described it as a never-ending nightmare. So if you're harassed or bullied within the workplace, in the brick and mortar at 9 to 5, it ends when you leave. The effects don't end, but the bullying behaviors or the harassment behaviors are sort of contained in a location. When we go into virtual harassment and bullying, there is no containment. It goes into the weekend. It goes into the personal life. And so this creates that never-ending nightmare for targets that you don't typically get with the face-to-face. So this is one of the arguments as to why it's worse. When we have this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, and the moving of essential workers from the brick and mortar workplace into remote settings, what's changed is there's been a shift of having a medley of communication where it may be email, texting, and face-to-face communications to now exclusively meet computer-mediated communications. And so that shift alters the risk for virtual harassment and cyberbullying in that you may have had it traditionally, but now it's going to be exclusively virtual harassment and cyberbullying if it's occurring. So technology brings with it possible anonymity, greater reach in terms of who gets to see it. So if it's a social media post, it can go viral very, very quickly. And that increases the impact on what we call the target, the victim of the bullying. There's also permanence. Permanence is where you can capture the evidence. You can save the email. You can screenshot the text. You can screenshot the social media post before it may get deleted. That permanence is helpful in terms of creating substantiation or creating evidence of the existence of harassment and cyberbullying. The problem with that permanence is that while it helps the target or victim substantiate their claim, it also amplifies the effect for the individual because now a single email that's harassing is actually being seen and experienced repeatedly anytime they look at the subject line in their inbox. So that permanence actually can change it from a single incident to a repeated incident. In addition, technology brings with it an invasion into the private life, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in one of my recommendations. All right, so before we get to my recommendations, we do need to talk about trolls versus cyberbullies. When we're looking at cyber deviance, there are these two factors, and they can be as stressful for the target as each other. So trolls are not the same thing as cyberbullies. Trolls are unknown to the recipient, and it can be a random attack. Versus cyberbullying, there is a known and pre-existing relationship. Might not be a good relationship, but it's a pre-existing relationship. Trolls fundamentally are seeking to create deception, to aggravate and have aggression, to disrupt something. And so for them, success is getting an indication from their target that they have deceived, aggravated, or disrupted. So when you're dealing with a troll, you really don't want to give them that success, all right? So the other thing that's different with trolls and cyberbullies is a targeted attack. The cyberbullying is picking out a specific individual to bully them. Trolls are like wide cast fishing. They basically throw a whole bunch of lines into the water and wait to see which line gets the nibble. As soon as a line gets a nibble, they hone in on that and reel in that fish. So trolls aren't actually targeting specific people. They're going through a quantity approach as opposed to cyberbullies go through a targeted approach. So trolls tend to operate on public and visible platforms like unprotected Zoom video conferences that are publicly listed, and social media like Facebook and Twitter. So if you have employees operating in those fields, they need to be aware of how to deal with trolls, how to identify them, and how to deal with them. For social media, don't bite that bait, okay? Don't make that fishing line live. The best approach is to delete and block that individual. Prevent them from creating that deception and disruption in your business services that you're trying to provide. If there is threatening content in there that may be criminal, save that as evidence before you delete and block, okay? Video conferencing, some guidelines for that to protect against trolls in the video conferencing is to set some settings appropriately. So having password required attendance, the use of waiting rooms, which means that participants don't get to interact with each other or set up stuff in the call before the person who's hosting it gets in there. You can also create disabling certain functions, so disable the ability to use virtual backgrounds. Those can be used for pornographic and sexual harassment, by the way. Disabling the ability to change the name tag underneath their window. Again, because that can make it anonymous. They may change their name and then become an anonymous, no video participant. Also, using direct invitations instead of open social media invites helps protect against trolls in video conferencing. And then having somebody monitor the chat and record the chat so that you can create that substantiation. So what are your legal rights and obligations in organizations regarding virtual harassment and cyberbullying? It falls under three legislative umbrellas, shall we say, and I first need to preface, I am not a lawyer, so I will not be giving you legal advice regarding this, but this is where you need to look for the legal information. The Canadian Human Rights Act prohibits harassment as it is a discriminatory practice. Provinces have their own human rights legislation, so if you are an employee of a local business, you fall under the provincial human rights legislation. If you work for a national organization or such as the federal government, you fall under the Canadian Human Rights Act. The implications of harassment with the human rights legislation or act is that it's a remedial in nature, meaning they're seeking to correct the wrong and create lessons and learning. It's not punitive in nature. There's also anti-bullying legislation, specifically cyberbullying in Canada. There is Canada's Bill C-13. This was brought in specifically to address cyberbullying that was occurring for teenagers in particular, but it applies to everybody. That the posting of sensitive videos or pictures is a criminal act if that person in the video or picture did not provide consent. So, for example, that Zoom video conference where the individual went and used the washroom, if that was posted without that woman's consent and was posted within Canada, it could fall under the Bill C-13 Act. And this comes with criminal charges, regardless of the age of the person who posted it. So that's a criminal. The employees also have the right to a safe workplace. So effective January 1st in 2020, Newfoundland and Labrador Occupational Health and Safety has included workplace violence and harassment, and bullying is included in this framework. Previously, prior to this, bullying was not considered part of human rights. Human rights was more about harassment. But bullying is very hazardous to health. It can actually lead to suicide, and it's very costly to individuals and organizations. So Occupational Health and Safety has brought this in as an employer, supervisor, and employee responsibility to prevent bullying and harassment from occurring within the workplace. The implications of failing to do so results in corporate fines, it can result in personal fines, and it can result in jail time. So this has a bit more teeth than the human rights. Similarly, there have been cases where harassment has been deemed to not be violation of the human rights because the abusive supervisor was not discriminatory in who they were harassing. They were harassing everybody. However, under the Occupational Health and Safety, this would be a violation of it. So a non-discriminatory harassment process is still a violation of this legislation. So harassment and bullying occurs for many, many, many different reasons. And this picture here highlights a whole bunch. This is about workplace mistreatment, which also includes incivility, which is, again, a cousin to harassment, who's a cousin to bullying. Behaviorally, the indicators of these for research are very similar, if not the same. We have everything from culture all the way up to victim characteristics that make them more likely to be targeted for harassment and bullying. I'm not going to go through all these because this would be a 6-hour lecture if I did, but the 6 recommendations I provide today actually help with the majority of these factors. So things like top leaders' behavior, power differentials and desire to express power, intent to harm, frustration, rumination, sleep deprivation, and retaliation or the coping by the target. So let's get into the recommendations. First and foremost, to help deal with power differentials, political intent to harm, and retaliatory or / coping techniques of a target, which can lead into bullying in turn, you need to have your respectful workplace policies plus an acceptable computer usage policy up front and center. And I make a distinction that these 2 policies, the respectful workplace and the acceptable computer usage policy, are very important for virtual harassment and cyberbullying for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, having them easily accessible online and sending out reminders helps identify people the consequences for engaging in these, right? So what are the consequences if I harass somebody? If I want to politically harm somebody, am I going to get harmed in turn? Well, yeah, because there's a policy you'd be in violation of. We also want to let people know how to handle the evidence. And again, this gets down to virtual harassment and cyberbullying in that there is evidence that people can accrue fairly easily, but if it's mishandled, may alter its ability to be used as evidence. So the best thing people can do is not move it, but keep it in the inbox, inform somebody of it. The IT department can do some fancy background work to identify what's going on in there, okay, to find the source of that. The cost of these behaviors would be clear to potential instigators. Policies don't stop all scenarios, but it would provide people with the knowledge of how to remedy or address it should it happen. And also, you can provide training surrounding video conferencing like Zoom or WebEx about recording the meeting and all chats to help for substantiation remedial efforts should an event occur. But you also need to, managerial speaking, inform people of what is being recorded and why it's being recorded. The reason why I have the 2 policies noted is that respectful workplaces require somebody to instigate the complaint. So it's typically the recipient who needs to file a complaint. Some organizations allow a witness to provide the initiation of a complaint. But the acceptable computer usage policy does not require somebody to file a complaint. The organization has the right to instigate follow-up and creating consequences to the individual for violating the misuse of their computer technology. So this one actually gives the organizations more leverage power for dealing with proactively virtual harassment and cyberbullying without requiring an individual to come forward and report it. The next recommendation is about sleep deprivation. So sleep is really an interesting issue. There's a lot of research coming in on that regarding organizational behavior, people's health, etc. We do know that sleep is highly important for the immune system, which for the pandemic, kind of important right now. But sleep also helps improve focus and productivity. And from an organizational perspective, again, that's really important. Some companies are actually bringing in sleep pods into their brick and mortar buildings to allow their employees to have naps. But coming back to our virtual harassment and cyberbullying and just general workplace mistreatment, clinical sleep deprivation, which is a single night of getting less than 7 hours of sleep, increases a person's hostility and reduces their impulse control. This makes them more likely to engage in mistreatment of others. Let me say that again. So having less than 7 hours of sleep in one night makes you more hostile, see the world in worst lights, that people are out to get you. You have to defend yourself against each other. And the impulse control, we all have these filters that we put before our mouths so that our inside thoughts sometimes stay in our heads. They don't come out, right? But when you have lower impulse control, those thoughts can sneak out, right? So this is, again, how good people engage in bad behaviors, okay? So sleep is really important to help promote a healthy and respectful workplace and prevent virtual harassment. Stress and rumination. So interestingly, there's some neat research looking at how rumination and stress increase the likelihood of people engaging in mistreatment. So how do we reduce our employee stress and likelihood of rumination? And that is by having your employee assistance program services up and running. Higher levels of stress increase the risk for uncivil and possibly harassing type behaviors. Stress also negatively impacts sleep. So you get this negative cycle going on that if people are stressed, for example, maybe COVID-19 and pandemic is stressing them. This may negatively impact their sleep, and now together they're stressed and sleep deprived, which can lead to more bad behaviors. So an EAP may aid in supporting better sleep habits. Thirdly, if someone is targeted with virtual harassment and cyberbullying, they will need these services. And they need these services to be visible and normalized so that it is a healthy and normal thing to go and get assistance. The ability to witness wellness is reduced with remoteness. Now, what I mean by that is people can fake feeling okay for a 20-minute period or maybe even up to an hour. But it's really hard for people to fake being okay for an 8-hour period of time in the workplace. When we have moved all of our non-essential workers into remote settings, into their homes, supervisors, coworkers, managers have a harder time monitoring and getting a sense of their employees' wellness. And so we need to say, hey, here's our EAPs, make them normal so that the person may self-identify and access that. What I like to say to my grad students is that just because grief, anxiety, and stress are normal responses right now to COVID-19 pandemic, it doesn't minimize the importance of getting support through these times. So stress and rumination, employee assistance programs, really helpful to create a respectful workplace and mitigate some of those issues. Fourth and fifth, it gets to frustration. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I know with my remote work shift and shifting everything onto video conferencing, there has been some stress from technology. And there's actually a really cool field of research looking at Technostress. And they even have these things called Technostress creators. So the rapid change of technology, the invasion of technology into our homes, the uncertainty of how to use the technology. All of these create frustration and stress with employees, and frustration is associated with mistreatment because one of the ways people express frustration can be through aggression. So for organizations to help mitigate the effects of frustration for virtual harassment, we need to look at providing IT assistance, providing access to IT training. You can also spend time having video chats with your employees and ask them how they're doing and what their challenges are and listening to them and helping them. So if they're having problems with their technology, finding ways to help resolve that helps reduce this frustration. Also, an interesting thing which is done by Germany actually, and some other companies are looking at this, is to promote a no email, no work time for people. This helps counteract the techno invasion component of Technostress. So don't take remote work as an opportunity for 24/7 productivity. You won't get it from your employees and it won't be good work. So actually promote the creation of boundary times will help for healthier email communications as well. Finally, but not the least important, but perhaps the most important recommendation is the top leaders' espoused values and behaviors. So as a leader in the organization, the number one thing you can do is to model respectful behavior and behavior that's supportive and seeking to connect with people for social resiliency. Social resiliency is a fancy word for saying help people deal with stress. right? That social connection. So we've talked about social distancing, but keeping social connection. Physical distancing, social connection, right? That's what we're getting to at this point. My own research has shown that even the use of emoticons and extra exclamation marks can actually increase fear of future workplace aggression. So we actually want to create and be very cognizant about writing respectful and professional emails. So using proper punctuation, spelling it properly, using the capitalizations appropriately, not throughout the entire sentence, right? And the withholding of derogatory humor. Do not use any derogatory humor in email, either derogatory against somebody else or even self-derogatory humor. That does not play well in virtual communications, all right? It doesn't belong there. So as a leader, you need to not incorporate that type of communication in email. One of the strongest predictors of workplace mistreatment is the leader's own actions and the importance they place on respectful behavior. So I behoove you to be the leader of exemplar behavior to show people how to communicate respectfully and professionally. That's my chat. So we're going to open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ford. You were right on time, very succinct. You did a fantastic job.
For those who know me, the 20 minutes is a real challenge for me to keep it that short.
So we've actually got a number of questions have come in both through the chat as well as through the Q&A. So for everyone watching, on the right side, you might see chat, participants, Q&A. You can use the chat or you can use the Q&A, and I'll grab your questions from there, and then
Perfect.
I'll ask them to Dianne.
And one quick second here before you hop over to the questions, I want to highlight the poll as well. We did an informal poll here. What I did was those 3 behaviors that were asked about, if you had or known of somebody else who's experienced these. So the rude, degrading, or offensive remarks, these or malicious gossip or rumors or gestures that seek to intimidate, those 3 behaviors are actual behaviors that are listed under the Canadian Human Rights Act for harassment behaviors. They are also used in incivility research and also in bullying research. So here we can see that the results are that not quite, but very close to half of the participants had experienced or known of somebody having rude, degrading, or offensive remarks. Fortunately, about 20%, maybe a little less, about the malicious gossip or rumors. Just under 25% experienced gestures that sought to intimidate. And when we look at the forms of communication, you can see that face-to-face was about 20% of them, but the rest were all on computer-mediated types of communication, with one other person saying about on a written note or on something. So you can see here that all of these are experienced within the workplace, and they're not confined to face-to-face communications. All 3 of those behaviors can easily be done through electronic means as well. So I just wanted to highlight that in the results of the poll, and that's on par with the research as well in terms of frequencies. Thanks, Justin. So questions?
Yeah, no problem. So one of the first questions we had was, how much does poor grammar or writing skills and missed context play in escalating situations, either real or perceived?
Okay, so in terms of communication skills may perhaps escalate. So one of the challenges with electronic communications is that we are actually missing out what we call media richness. That in face-to-face conversations, you get to see, if we were face-to-face right now in full person, you would see my entire body's motions, you'd hear my intonations, you see my facial expressions, you get to see what my elbows are doing. Video conferencing, you get little glimpses of that. So it's a little bit richer than email. And email actually is rife with misunderstandings. There's an author by the name of Byron in I'm trying to think what year was, around 2007 or 1998, one of those two, 1998, who argued that email actually cannot carry emotional weight. their research has found that people tend to infer emotional content in email negatively than what the author had intended. So yeah, how one types it in, presents it, definitely can lead to some misunderstanding. And in incivility, that's definitely the case, and usually people can follow up and clarify clear the air pretty quickly on that. When we get into repetitive harassment and cyberbullying, it's not usually a one-off mistake. It's intentional.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another question. Could trolling turn into cyberbullying if you fell for the bait?
No, it would still be trolling because, again, still there's no pre-existing relationship. So now, I don't want to minimize the effect of trolling. Trolling can have a very negative effect on the psychological well-being of the individual who's being targeted. And it certainly could feel like stalking at that point. Repetitive messaging that is threatening should also be reported to the police in actuality, because it may be criminal at a certain point.
Okay. Questions still coming in. Thanks, everybody. If an individual pursues a legal remedy, for example, defamation of character, does the provincial remedy, or CHRA, still pursued, or does it go into abeyance pending the result of the legal remedy?
Okay, so that requires a lawyer's take on it. I've had some experience with human rights myself. Typically, there's sort of a hierarchy in terms of who gets to hear the case first. Ideally, the organization, if they have policies and procedures in place, get to be the first go at it. If there's failure in terms of procedural justice and proper procedure, or they say, nah, we're not going to deal with it, then it would go up to the provincial or the federal human rights, depending on whose jurisdiction it is. And then at that point, it's kind of said and done. In terms of libel or going into the civil court, that requires legal advice regarding substantiation of that claim. And that would be looking for punitive measures as opposed to human rights, which is remedial measures.
Okay, thank you. Another attendee said that their understanding is that volunteers are also covered under a piece of legislation you mentioned. Is that correct?
Yeah, volunteers, anyone associated with that organization would be, they have that right to a safe organization. So everybody has human rights. Okay, so that covers everybody. Occupational health and safety legislation would also cover volunteers as well, because they're working on behalf of the company. They're just simply not getting paid for it. But yes, and ethically, yes. So, let's give our volunteers, those really important people, that same benefit. Yeah.
Thank you. One person mentioned that they have used SurveyMonkey at their work to much success, but some comments still become very offensive. It is anonymous, so the person making those comments can't be identified. Yeah. This person did require that all comments be submitted on a work computer from now on, but they're wondering, is there anything else that they could do?
Yeah, so anonymity is a really big issue when we get into virtual harassment and cyberbullying. Those types of one-off harmful comments do constitute harassment, but they wouldn't constitute bullying in that they're not a persistent, repetitive pattern. So when and they wouldn't be deemed criminal either, because it needs to be repetitive as well. But if you use that computer, the work computer, your computer acceptable usage policy can help gather that. But anonymity, that's one of the biggest problems, is that identifying who the offender is is really problematic. And typically you can't identify somebody if it's anonymous unless it's repetitive and it become a criminal issue and you can get subpoenas. Or the IT department can identify through sign-in, and then you go through acceptable usage computer policy that way. Yeah. So anonymity is a big issue because it actually amplifies the negative effect on the target. It creates more fear, it creates more anger, and it hog-ties the person for appropriate remediation as well. So that is the biggest problem really with cyberbullying and virtual harassment.
Do you know how long the one day of lack of sleep will affect someone?
That's a really good question. Usually until you catch up your sleep. However, the problem is that the most people that I've talked to, and I've talked to a lot of people about their sleep, is that it's not one person, it's not the person getting 8 hours all the time and then one night of 7 hours, because that person who does that typically will grab a nap or grab extra sleep that night sort of thing because they're feeling the effects. The problem that I found is that people typically get around 6 hours of sleep on average. And so they're not only clinically sleep deprived, they're also chronically sleep deprived. So it takes a while to catch up on that. And when I say a while, I mean months, but very, very, very worth it to put in the effort to catch up. Yeah. Behaviorally and health-wise, it just makes a huge difference.
That's an interesting fact because I didn't know that under 7 hours. I had kind of an assumption in my own parent brain that 6 hours is an achievement.
Well, and the society we actually do highlight as 6 is normal, but biologically speaking, and our bodies are biological and our minds are biological, that's not normal. It's 8 to 10 hours.
Another question, does the use of emoticons have a negative impact in virtual workplace communication?
So this one, I'm an avid emoticoner myself. I'm just so youthful at heart. But my own research showed that this is actually negative. So, for example, I had an experiment where I had people go, I randomly assigned them to 4 different conditions. One group got neutral, sort of happy kind of content, and with proper professional writing. And then another group had the exact same content, sort of happy, neutral, including a self-derogatory humor popped in there, but with emoticons, some caps letters, and I even threw in a hashtag in there, hashtag high five, so it was all positive. And then the other 2 groups were with incivility. So one was, again, very professional writing, proper punctuation, no emoticons, but harassing, very insulting types of comments in there. And then the other ones had the emoticons and the hashtag facepalm kind of thing going on in that. And what the results were was the ones with incivility in them, it didn't matter if there was emoticons in there because they were already increased anger, decreased positive affect. They weren't feeling as happy. They had higher fear of workplace aggression. They had higher fear for their personal safety. Their job satisfaction decreased. And this is just with one email. And then the other group, the neutral content, the professional people had no negative effects, no increased anger, no extra fear. Their positive mood didn't change. But these guys that had the emoticons with the positive content actually had higher fear of future workplace aggression. They didn't differ on anger or positive affect or job satisfaction, but there was something happening in terms of expectations that is not healthy for the organization. And so I think it's because it violates people's professional expectations of communication, right? That we expect when it's a work email, we expect there to be a certain level of decor, sort of level of presentation. And so even though the content was neutral or positive, the presentation violated some professionalism. So what else is going to be violated? So the use of emoticons, and I have to say I use them myself, so I now feel like I have to stop that. But it can shift something that's not good for an organization. Yeah.
Mhm. Will the contents, especially recommendations, be made available to the participants? I also had a question about your presentation. Could it be made available after as well?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, those recommendations, we can make those positive. Yeah, acceptable. Yeah.
Okay, great. You mentioned that the institution has a right to investigate the use of computers appropriately. Is there a responsibility to do so? So are essentially negligent in performing this if bullying should occur with follow-up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the challenges is that quite frequently the legal environment and policy environment often lag behind the reality, right? Or perhaps the ethics of it. There are many organizations that do this very proactively. I know, for example, there's some research papers that talk about, for example, schools using sort of firewall / analysis back software to look for certain red flags that would highlight that there's likely cyberbullying occurring. And so they use those analytics to identify, and they can go and investigate a little bit closer. In terms of, are they culpable if they don't do this? Well, again, I think this is where there's that lag between ethics, legal, and what's happening. It could be argued that since the organization has the legal responsibility to prevent harassment and discrimination, if it's occurring and they're aware of it and they're not doing anything, that's a problem. If they're willfully blind to it, that's a problem. So there's no right answer here yet. So, yeah.
Okay. The next question. You mentioned normalizing your EAP. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on how to do that?
Talk about it. Make it a living thing. So every year we have Bell Talk, Let's Talk, right? And so we make mental health a once a year. Hey, we're all in it. We're all here to talk, but then you don't hear about it afterwards. So again, coming into what leaders do in terms of modeling, the leaders can talk about the utility of the EAPs. They may even say, hey, you know what, this COVID thing's been really challenging for me. So I called up our EAP and they've been brilliant. They have some helpful resources for me, and I think that everybody should access this, right? So making it alive and a regular part of conversation would make it more accessible to an individual and more likely that they would take up that service if they need it, because then it won't be a sign of them being the odd one out, the victim who can't handle it, because frankly, targets who are being cyberbullied, that's what's being undermined on them right then and there, is that they're being told they're the one out, that they are weak, that they are that they're inhuman, right? And so by EAPs being normalized, them partaking in it would not be seen as an additional cue of weakness.
Is it better to engage in more video engagement rather than emails or messaging?
Yeah, so there's an interesting issue about that. There's not enough research right now for me to give a proper report on that. Theoretically speaking, it would provide better cues of intent. Jokes would be read properly through video conferencing, whereas if you said the same content in email, might not fly, right? Video conferencing, there is some chatter about how video conferencing can sort of fatigue people. That is a more intense form of communication than even face-to-face conversation is, that you may be looking and pulling in more details and information than you would when you're just having a chat with somebody in person. But when you're getting into the sensitive topics, like how are you doing, maybe even talking about performance, goals, etc., then yeah, I would say video conferencing would be a more appropriate form of communication than even the phone would be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't want people relying on video conferencing because you may get a burnout effect on that in terms of fatigue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If there is an old boys club mentality within a workplace, do you have any advice on how to handle cyberbullying when many superiors are a part of that club?
Yeah. So organizational culture, again, is a major component of that. And when there is a toxic culture, then it actually prevents the reporting of it in-house. To that extent, I would recommend that they talk to either a labor lawyer, human rights lawyer, or even call up, Workplace NL regarding occupational health and safety with bullying. And cyberbullying is under that umbrella of workplace bullying. So it is, unfortunately, the toxic culture. And various cultures can work really strongly against workplace health and safety in that regard. Yeah, I think you'd have to go outside to be able to get the appropriate assistance. Quite frequently, when people do report it in-house, they can experience what's called double victimization, because then they are blamed, they are ousted, they are then experience bullying tactics from the leaders who don't believe them, and that's additionally harmful to the individual. Mm-hmm. Also, speaking to the EAP may also help with that as well.
Yeah, true. With respect to employee supports that should be provided via an EPA, where does that leave contract workers who are not considered employees, for example, in the federal government, who don't have access to those supports during or following a casual work term, which also makes them more vulnerable to cyberbullying and harassment? Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that I had on that slide of all the factors, victim precipitated factors, so any individual who's deemed sort of an outsider is more likely to be targeted. And so contingent workers, contract workers, temp workers, part-time workers typically don't have the access to the types of support like the EAPs that full-time employees and permanent employees would have. However, there are access to health, so public health, having a conversation with your family doctor. They can refer you, or there's central intake that can help as well. Or you can go to a private counselor. Now, the private counselor costs money, but if you have additional health insurance that you pay into yourself separately, that might be covered as well. So the resources for psychological health assistance for those individuals, unfortunately, have to come from another source, but they are available. Yeah.
Okay. Just a note to everyone, looking at the time, the discussion is going fantastic. Thank you, Dianne, for being so flexible. I've got 3 more questions to ask, and okay. I think we'll leave it at those last 3, given that it's 1:48 now, and that'll take us probably just before 2. Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And also, for anyone who does have questions, please feel free that you can email them to me. Or if you got Dianne's email, you can email her as well. I can forward those questions on to Dianne. So don't feel like you only have these next few minutes to ask these questions. Next question was, what is the threshold for incivil behavior, particularly repetitive incivil behavior, to be categorized as bullying?
Okay. All right. So incivility behavior is deemed as sort of that one-off and where the intention is really ambiguous. So incivility can occur within the workplace, and it can actually spiral within the workplace where it becomes one person's rude to one person and that person's rude to somebody else, and it just spirals out of control. When you get an uncivil behavior occurring repeatedly, so rude and degrading comment once off. Well, that's rude, right? That's incivility. But if that becomes repeated, then that hops over into the harassment realm. When it comes to bullying, the participants that I've had report bullying, they're experiencing it on a daily basis, right? So once every couple of weeks, that kind of comment, that would be, what I would deem into the harassment realm. But daily, that's bullying. Like that is just, it's insidious. It genuinely is insidious. That's the way you can distinguish between incivility is you can brush it off really easily. Harassment, it gets harder to brush it off and it starts impacting you. It impacts your sense of self. But bullying is insidious and it makes you not want to live. Like it's just like there's a term called bullycide. And I had in a slide, but I didn't mention it. Australia actually has an anti-bullying law for workplace called the Brodie's Law. And that's because this woman by the last name of Brodie, who worked at a coffee shop, she was being bullied at the workplace so persistently, she committed suicide. So individuals who are bullied are at a higher rate of suicide than people who are not. Bullycide is sort of at a 20% rate. Regular population suicide that I've heard about is around 7%. So it's this difference from brushing it off to, ooh, this is really starting to impact me, to just insidious. That's bullying. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. What factors should be considered from an audience perspective? In particular, in the context of online learning in the K-12 education context, what would you suggest to protect teachers and students from inappropriate comments, images, etc., being shared by a student in a virtual classroom environment?
Yeah.
Are there recommendations that could be helpful in situations where those engaged online are children or young people who may not have good judgment or impulse control and may not have supervision in their home when they're accessing the online classroom?
Right, or their supervisor at home doesn't realize that this is an issue. So definitely you want to, for educational classrooms and such, there are a couple of things that you can do to help prevent or reduce the likelihood. First and foremost, do training, right? Provide a YouTube video, some sort of video, educational video, where there is no interaction, that the person can consume it at home in their privacy, of what to do, what's appropriate behavior, what not to do, why is it important not to do those behaviors, and what is our ultimate objective with this learning in class online, which is to learn and to connect. The kids have already had anti-bullying training, so for them to get additional training into the virtual context would help. The younger kids who might not have already had the bully training, you might want to bring that in as well into the virtual realm. The other factor is that accidents happen with the younger kids. They may, for example, the word duck is one letter away on the keyboard from a word that is highly inappropriate in an educational process, okay? So kids may post in chat and have major issues out of that, which is unintentional. So again, one of the parts of training was, if there's the use of chat room, and again, you might not want to use the chat room, because if it's a single teacher teaching, she might not be able to monitor the chat room and monitor all the kids' videos and interactions and stuff. So either shut down the chat room functionality, or teach the kids first in that video of proofread your line before you post, right? And just, it's an editing process for the kids who are, under the, grades kindergarten 1, 2, and 3, that's going to be a problem as well. But so for them, I would actually shut down the chat. But for the high school kids, make it very clear what the consequences are. Make it abundantly clear. If you are found to be doing this type of behavior, you will be excused. There will be suspensions. I mean, it's the same thing as if they were being bullies in the school system, right? There's systems in place for that. So make it abundantly clear. This context counts just as much. Yeah, and I could go on and on that it impacts witnesses as well. So the training up front is really, really important.
Thanks, Dianne. What are the implications regarding acute and chronic PTSD of the affected individual?
Ooh, okay. So I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I am familiar with chronic post-traumatic stress symptoms, and which is associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Targets and victims of, and I don't like to use the word victim because, again, that double victims the individual. The targets of harassment and bullying can and do experience post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a guarantee that they're going to experience, but it's highly likely that they can. And what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is that it impacts their personal relationships. It impacts their physical health, their mental health. It can impact their commitment to their career and the commitment to their organization. Individuals who experience post-traumatic stress disorder may want to quit that profession, right? So they leave that profession. So it has a major implication long-term for the individual unless they get help. And so again, this is why EAPs are really important. Sometimes an individual who's a targeted virtual harassment or cyberbullying, they might be in a state of trauma up front, and it might take them a while to start to realize that they need help. Okay, and that can take months. If there's somebody around them who's identifying, saying, "Hey, you know what? I think it would be helpful for you to go and talk to somebody," right? That can help speed up the process, but it does require professional assistance. Absolutely. And it has massive repercussions for their personal lives, their professional lives, and perhaps even their performance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Last one here now. One of our guests was face-to-face bullied in the workplace before they left their position in December. Would having kept a logbook of comments and dates been helpful to their cause?
Yeah. So this is one of those things that's really difficult. So both in harassment and bullying, creating a log of incidents, dates, times, who said what happened, that all helps with substantiation. Mm-hmm. From the target's experience, though, it's an interesting problem in that to start collecting evidence, it means that there's a loss of trust in that organization, and it's an additional harm to the individual in that they've now said, "Oh, I have to document what's happening to me," and there's a loss of faith in there, and that is part of the injury as well, quite frankly. But yes, that is from a legal perspective in terms of the process for human rights or what have you, or for substantiation with occupational health and safety. Absolutely, that helps clarify your case. Absolutely. But it's hard to do, and it hurts to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Dianne, that was our last question. Again, anyone with questions that we didn't get to, please email myself, and I will hand them along. Or you can send them to munalum@mun.ca, and we'll get them to Dianne. But thank you to everyone who joined us online. We had high numbers the whole time, lots of questions, which is fantastic. A big thank you, Dr. Ford, for taking the time out of your day. A thank you to the Gardner Center. Yeah.
Sorry, Justin, I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. Sorry. Before we wrap up, I do want to highlight the resources for people, the Newfoundland Human Rights Commission, where you have thinkhumanrights.ca. It's their URL. And if you want additional information about the occupational health and safety, you can look at workplacenl.ca. If you search harassment on that site, they actually have a great webinar on how to create a harassment prevention organization. So they posted the links there in the chat. So I'm sorry, back to you, Justin.
Yeah, no problem. I just mistyped the word questions as I put in the Mun alumni email for people to send future questions to. So a big thank you to the Gardner Center for connecting us with Dianne, as well as John is in the background. He's with the Conference and Event Services team at Memorial's America Innovation Exchange. John is incredibly great support. The Alumni Engagement team itself, our office, is working hard to help keep everyone connected. And we want to provide these kinds of meaningful engagement opportunities that alumni want most. Our next leadership webinar is 1 week from today on Wednesday, May 27th at 1 p.m. with Dr. Tom Cooper, entitled Adapting Organizational Strategy in Uncertain Times. You can find that as well as the other events on our event page, on the alumni event page. We hope to see you there. Take care. Thank you again to everybody. I wish everybody the best.
Thank you.